Sumo deadlifts, a contentious topic in 2023, but I just want to offer you a bit of advice and a technique that you can use in your training to improve your deadlift workouts. The idea of this is basically alternating the sumo with conventional forms of deadlifts. Now, before we go on to that, let's just address the elephant in the room. This whole meme that sumo is cheating. Now, I think a lot of you guys are too young to remember where this all came from and where it originated from. But also, some of the influencers and even IFBB pro bodybuilders that talk about sumo as being cheating are also now too young in 2023 to remember where it originally came from. So, originally, it was a joke. I'm surprised that it's lasted for 20 years, but originally the whole sumo is cheating thing was a joke. And let me just explain where it came from so you guys know. Consider this a bit of history. So back 20 plus years ago, we're literally talking the early ends of the internet, the early forum days, early 2000s and late 99s. There was a large amount of equipped, geared powerlifting. Okay, loads of especially double ply, really big fat dudes in really tight gear doing a lot of powerlifting. Now, because of the use of powerlifting gear, they would all generally pull sumo because you could get more out of the gear. And a lot of these guys were super fat. They also had body types which were very, very good for squats. Long torsos, short little bit of limbs, and they could squat a lot of weight. Some of these guys are squatting over 1,000 pounds in gear. Now, because of their leverages, they were generally better off pulling sumo. So they would use the squat suits to really wrench themselves down into position with their legs out wide in a sumo deadlift. And that meant they could pull halfway decent sumo deadlifts, enough to get them a good total. So there was a lot of backlash against equipped powerlifting 20 years ago. And rightfully, it's a bit of a joke. And a lot of people said, look, equipped is cheating. And sumo especially is cheating because most of the guys who were pulling sumo in gear couldn't pull anywhere close to that in conventional because the gear gave them quite a lot when they were pulling sumo. You don't really get much out of the gear when you're pulling conventional. It's just not the way the suits work. So that's why sumo was considered cheating. It was from the geared ranks. And then, of course, as the internet is, people forget the original meanings and it bleeds over to the raw lift as well. So now raw sumo is cheating as well. And it goes on and on. But back in the original days, that's where it came from. And then over the years, one guy says it to another guy, says it to another guy, says it to another guy. And before you know it, 20 years down the line, people have completely forgotten where the original meaning came from. And it was never meant to be said about actual proper sumo deadlifts without gear or like hybrid pulls. Because most people don't really pull sumo. They pull a sort of hybrid form where they're a little bit narrower and their hands are inside their knees. Actual proper sumo, which is super wide using the gear, that was generally done in a way where you couldn't possibly hope to replicate the poundages used if you were pulling raw or conventional style. So that's where it all came from. So now you know. So anyway, moving on. Now, in terms of benefits of the sumo deadlift, for the first few years, I actually pulled sumo. And from what I remember, it was quite a good way for me to pull big numbers. Like my first 5-plate deadlift was a sumo deadlift. Mostly because it meant that my lower back didn't have to work quite as hard. I specifically recall one time when I was in a powerlifting meet, I'd hurt my back on squats, and going into the deadlift, I wasn't quite sure about what I was supposed to be doing because my back was hurting. Now, I couldn't pull anything conventional at that time because my lower back was hurting. I was trying to massage my back and everything. In the end, I just pulled sumo. I could pull sumo with a bad back. So sumo is definitely a little bit less intensive on the lower back, and I would say probably the entire back, probably because you're not quite as bent over. If you do the sumo correctly and your legs are out wide and your hips are close to the bar, your torso will be more upright. So there's more of a focus on the hips, the glutes, hamstrings, and I would say quads as well in a sumo deadlift. Also inner thighs to regions. There's more of a focus on those areas. The entire lower body region is worked quite heavily with the sumo deadlift, much less on the lower back and upper back of the conventional deadlift. So when it comes to the sumo deadlift, you have this advantage because it seems to target a lot of the areas which aren't targeted quite as heavily in a conventional deadlift. So if we just switch over to the conventional for a second, conventional very much heavily works the muscles of the lower back and also mid back and upper back as well. It's a very back intensive lift, probably because you are mostly bent over when you're starting the lift. As well as that, it works the glutes quite heavily. Now, depending on how you pull, you may or may not work the hamstrings quite a lot. Depends on how you pull, how strict your form is. I think the stricter your form is in terms of your back position, the more the hamstrings are engaged. The looser you are and the more rounded your back is, the less your hamstrings are engaged, and it's more of a lower back, maybe quads, glute lift. But in any case, hamstrings are still heavily involved. So we have a situation where the sumo deadlift seems to hit some of the areas which aren't hit by the conventional deadlift, and vice versa. Whereas the sumo really emphasizes the inner thighs, glutes, quads, and not so much the lower back and the upper back and the mid back. The conventional deadlift really heavily hits the lower back, the mid back, the upper back. And so you have the situation where we have two forms of deadlifts which actually are looking to be quite synergistic. And that is the gist of this video. The idea that you can alternate sumo with conventional to make sure you get benefits from both. Now, in terms of implementation, so there are loads of people who are trying to improve their deadlifts and their entire posterior region with different forms of conventional deadlifts, like stiff leg deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, good mornings, hyperextensions, things like that. All those things are great lifts, but they're all basically very similar lifts because you have your foot in the same position. What I would urge you guys to do is to consider using a completely different form of deadlift. Use a sumo variation. It could be a regular sumo. It could be a RDL sumo, a stiff leg sumo, sumo style good mornings as well. But in the first instance, I would suggest some of you guys who are doing different Romanian deadlift variations, different stiff leg variations, just try a completely different form because it's going to offer you a completely different set of benefits, which you're not getting from the conventional foot position RDLs, conventional foot position SLDLs, because they're all still very, very similar lifts. Go completely out of the box. Try some sumo variants. Bring them back, all right? Let's start a movement and make them a bit more accepted. Let's reclaim what they were useful for in the first place as a good standalone exercise. They're not cheating. We're not using powerlifting gear. We can use the benefits of some wide stance work to help fill in the gaps we've created from just doing a lot of close stance work over the years. So it's a completely different lift. It will offer you a much wider range of benefits in doing yet another close stance variation, like more RDLs, more stiff legs, more deficit RDLs, more deficit stiff legs. Try something completely different. Now, in terms of how to implement this specifically, it really depends on how often you're deadlifting. So a very common setup that I use for some of my more powerlifting oriented clients is to deadlift twice a week. First day of the week is heavy triples, usually starting off with about 8 triples in week 1, going down to about 4 triples or 3 triples in week 3, and then tapering off in week 4. With that approach, you could do a simple 3x5 or 3x6 of sumo deadlifts on another day per week and just have that using just straight linear progression across the month. So in that way, we have the conventional deadlift as the main exercise for triples, which vary with percentages. And then another day, you use essentially just an RPE approach with sumo deadlifts. That's a nice setup for a powerlifter focused guy. For a hypertrophy enthusiast, you probably want to go a little bit close to failure. And maybe in that case, bear in mind, if you're doing conventional and sumo, they are much more different lifts. So you'll probably have an easier time fitting them both into the same week. If you're doing just conventional with RDLs and stiff leg deadlifts, they're all basically a very similar lift. They're all a close stance hip hinge. Now, you might find if you use a close stance hip hinge for one day of the week and a sumo variation for another day of the week, you can get away with more deadlifting because it's more variety. So if one session you're doing, say, about 1 or 2 sets of 5 or 4 to 6 on the conventional deadlift, next time you deadlift, do the same thing, 1 or 2 sets of 4 to 6 reps in the sumo deadlift, and just alternate that depending on how often you deadlift. If you currently deadlift once a week, feel free to try that and alternate it week by week. So 1 week conventional, next week sumo. If you actually deadlift twice a week, which quite a few of you should be doing because you're not strong enough yet where you have to deadlift once a week. If you're deadlifting twice a week, perfect. Pick one day to do mostly close stance variations, pick another day to do mostly wide stance sumo variations, and that is much better variety. You're much more likely going to be able to plug in any strength and hypertrophy gaps in your physique by doing so. It's also very good at safeguarding you for injury too, so it has that benefit. So, as I say, just to summarize that, the conventional form of deadlifts with a closer stance has a lot of unique benefits for the body. It's a really good way to work the entire lower back because you're typically more bent over, really great for the hamstrings as well, very good for the glutes. The sumo deadlift variation offers a different set of benefits. So more wide stance hip hinge work can offer some unique benefits in terms of the inner thighs, also the quads, and it seems to hit the hips and glutes in a different way. So it's a great form of cross training for both lifts, both hip hinge type of variations. You can alternate them both and really get a lot of benefit. And I feel that's probably a better way to alternate things rather than constantly alternating between close stance variations. Because I found my inner thighs, as I was squatting with a relatively close stance and pulling always with a close stance, led to some gaps. So when I started to include sumo deadlifts, when I started to re-include sumo deadlifts later on in my career, I found that I was able to plug those gaps and make sure that I was getting plenty of good balance, which led to my body being more injury resistant and happier in general. So yeah, really good idea. I think it's a good way to go. And if you want to implement it, just base it off how often you currently deadlift and just insert in some sumo deadlift variations, some wide stance variations as part of your pool of exercise you rotate through. So give it a try and let me know how it goes for you. And also let me know if you're surprised by the little history lesson and the actual origin of where sumo deadlift cheating came from. It did come from equipped lifting. It's not something which I thought was going to stand the test of time, but there we go. That is the internet. Anyway, all right, guys, I will call it there. Do make sure you like this video. Make sure you subscribe, share on social media, and tell your friends about the channel. So I'll speak to you in the next one. Take care.